I'd like to welcome on stage a few more people for our discussion right now. So please, with us, we're going to have Bernardine. Hi. Welcome from Vastari in the UK. Please get a seat down. I'm Troy Kuratian from the Guggenheim. Please. And please, an applause for our speakers. So guys, well, good to have you here because first thing I asked actually to them was like, can I have your business card? So there was a problem actually with you because you didn't have any. Because my question was like, what do you put as professionals of the art world and the culture world, what do you put on your business card? So Bernardine is easy, you put CEO. Yeah. So that's a position, I'm okay with that. Troy, you put curator, architecture and digital initiatives. I'd like to ask actually like, what is the point between the two of them? It's kind of amazing that you put architecture and digital initiative on the same one. So are you a professional of digital when you're a professional architecture?
Okay, so I think it deserves an autobiographical answer.
Yeah, please tell us how you went to that point.
So it's kind of the position which I started about a year and a half ago. I think was the kind of confluence of what am I not here? More like this? Okay. So I started the position about a year and a half ago at the Guggenheim. Becoming a curator was not my life plan. It was kind of totally accidental. My life plan actually was kind of a strange one. I started originally in computer engineering in the late 90s and early 2000s. I was working as a developer and kind of software manager in Silicon Valley in 2001 when the bubble popped in a very kind of visceral, dramatic way. I was still in school at the time, so I went back to school, finished my studies, and then basically traumatized by the kind of implosion of kind of what felt like this ephemeral digital kind of passing fad. I went into the exact opposite, which was architecture. So the kind of heaviest, most kind of durable, lasting possible discipline. I finished architecture school just as the larger economy collapsed. And also just as digital technology was kind of coming back and kind of realized, we'd all kind of realized that it wasn't just a kind of mini wave, but a kind of massive deluge into our lives. And so I started working as a digital technologist. So basically I went back to technology to pay off my architecture school debt. And then kind of accidentally, well, actually I was asked to curate a small exhibition for a car company. And after that they said, well, congratulations, your company's been hired. We want you to be our North American curators. My partner and I, and we had no idea what that meant. Except that car companies paid really well. So we started a company which eventually evolved into what we were calling innovation consulting. And it was basically just providing kind of trend forecasting, network building, all kinds of weird services that you kind of can't go to school for and have kind of, you can't get a visa for. And because it's really not a kind of codified profession. It was kind of more, I think at a time when companies were feeling the kind of digital disruption wave, the CEOs were saying, well, we've got to innovate. The middle managers were saying, we don't know what that means. And we were telling them, well, we're innovation consultants. So if you pay us, you're innovating. And so we did that for a few years, and at the same time I was teaching and running a research lab at an architecture school. And then the Guggenheim came along and said, well, we used to have a couple of kind of associate architecture curatorial positions because we don't exactly do architecture exhibitions, but we have these really important buildings. And so I think the Guggenheim needed a kind of architectural kind of intelligence on staff for when newspapers called for quotes and whatnot. But at the time, the museum was also kind of feeling, I think, the pressure of disruption. And a lot of the museum peers, the Guggenheim kind of, the myopia of New York is pretty powerful. So I think they were looking at the Met, who we heard from earlier, the New Museum, and MoMA, which all had actually your slide, which I promise I won't tweet. Actually, what's funny is I had a very similar slide that I took out because I was worried people would tweet it. So
yeah,
it's a dangerous slide.
Big note I wrote a big note to myself saying, remind people not to do it. Because people will email me and say, you're saying my job title's stupid? Yeah.
Actually, so did you have to invent your job title?
Well, here, so I'll just really quickly finish. So
Sure.
what the Guggenheim was realizing was that all these other museums were creating job titles like that, and the Guggenheim was quite slow on the uptake. And so I think our chief curator at the time, Nancy Spector, who's a very savvy woman and institution builder, realized that if we could kind of co-opt the digital kind of intelligence into curatorial, then curatorial could be leading the conversation in the Guggenheim as we kind of went through the process of digitization. So the two architecture curators had just left, so she kind of fused those two jobs together into a more senior position and then kind of tacked digital on top. And I don't think that there was a really kind of master thesis around why architecture and digital. I think it was much more a kind of accidental, this is where we had place to tack on digital. And it so turned out that I had had this very strange career path of going from digital to architecture, and I think ultimately I was probably the only candidate that matched the job requirements. So I think I've answered your question-ish.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the only candidate to match a very weird and broad and rich way to put it. Actually, Emily, did you have to invent your own job also, or your own job title? It actually happened to me several times to be hired and to be asked, what's your job title, by the people who were hiring me. So can you tell us a bit more about the context of museums?
Yeah, so a couple of points. I did invent my own title a couple of times, very similarly to what we're describing here. But I also found that I was often, the way that it often happened was, first of all, a negotiation with my boss about what we were specifically talking about. But it was also often about personalities, and I think that that is something that I've really discovered recently is one of the biggest drivers within the way museums work, is that it is often entirely, even the structure of the entire staff is about its personality and history driven. And so when something is working a specific way and then you try to replace it with another person and you see the whole staff change because of that, I think that's because it's all based on the individual people who are there. And that's something that is very unique to the way that museums operate, is we have these sort of shifting boundaries. And then I was also going to say, that I think the specific word usage relates to that, in that, like I mentioned in my talk, that a lot of these words have very vague definitions, and so it can be totally based on what people's personal interpretation of that word is. So I was not allowed to use interpretation in my title because of the way that education felt about that specific word. I wasn't in the education department. And so it was like the way another department felt about a specific word that was dictating. So I think it can often be these very touchy-feely things because it's not a hard and fast science. You're blending and blurring so many lines.
Thank you. Bernardine, your job title is actually quite easy, CEO. But isn't it weird? So you're an entrepreneur in the cultural sector. Can you tell us a bit more about how you got into that?
Yeah, actually, I sometimes describe our startup as also setting up a company because we really wanted to work in a specific place, and then inventing our own job because we thought that there was a hole there that needed to be filled. So we felt that there needed to be a nonpartisan entity between museums and private collectors to help more collaborations take place. So that's kind of where our company came in and said, look, we can be that nonpartisan person that helps put together teams and collaborations without having anything to do with the art market. And so it's kind of a wonderful place to be in between the art market and museums, and we invented it, really. So it's similarly kind of going along the same lines. But then we work with a lot of these people who have also interesting job titles, and finding the people within the organization or outside the organization that is relevant for a specific project is very difficult because every institution is different.
Actually, what kind of people do you hire to work with you? I remember meeting 2 years ago in Warsaw, actually, part of the Vastari team. I was already a partner, actually, of We Are Museums. And they had actually curatorial backgrounds. How is that? Aren't these people supposed to work inside of a museum?
I think that's a really good point. A curatorial background is actually a huge part of most of our team. We're all art historians. We all have a passion for the objects. We all have trained that way, but then also have an understanding of technology and how technology can be used efficiently to create networks and to encourage collaborations. And you don't have to be in the museum as a curator.
Troy, the Guggenheim is a pretty important institution, has been going for a long time now. Was it difficult to establish yourself as a curator within the organization, given the fact that you didn't go through a classic European college curatorial experience?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't put it in the past tense. It's still a difficulty. No, I think, well, I mean, my colleagues have been incredibly gracious and kind of welcoming me in. I think it's interesting because the Guggenheim is fundamentally an art museum, and it's sort of mid-sized. I mean, I think we're about 250 people, so we're an order of magnitude smaller than the Met, and an order of magnitude bigger than Foam. But the curatorial department is quite kind of vertically integrated. It's not like there's curators of Egyptian art and curators of this and that. It's kind of a mix. Everybody does a little bit of everything except for me. I'm the one person who's kind of like not allowed to touch art in a way, is sort of the feeling that I got when I came there. And what I realized was it was this incredible kind of liberation, because museums are kind of like well-oiled machines for doing what they do, which is putting up art exhibitions. And so what I realized at the beginning was if I decided that my practice as a curator was not going to be to make art exhibitions, then I could really start to kind of hack the museum machinery, because everything that I do and have done since I arrived is totally out of the normal for the museum. So I think the museum, and actually I think the Guggenheim Museum, and maybe this is a trait of kind of older kind of established institutions, I think internally it still has trouble understanding who I am and what I do. But I think externally the museum kind of discourse and criticism and media, I think, move much faster than the inside of institutions sometimes. So some of the work that I've done has been totally understandable to the kind of discursive, or the kind of written machinery of people talking about what's happening in the world, but it doesn't always seem to kind of penetrate within the walls of the museum. And that's actually been a huge asset, because I think some of the stuff that I've done, when it started to get a little bit of press attention, if people within the Guggenheim had been paying more attention, they might want to start slowing down the kind of rate of innovation a little bit, because it might have seemed like it was starting to run away.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Do you think that slower innovation is also due to, well, we've been around for about 4.5 years. And 4.5 years ago, we very much thought of museum roles as being something kind of permanent, like the tenured curator who's decades at an institution. And we've actually, in the last 2 years, had to completely change the way we think about it, because people keep moving every few years. Do you think that affects the way that innovation works within the institution as well? Like the way that every time there's someone new?
I think totally. I think what's really interesting is curatorial departments, at least the one that I'm familiar with, are treated much more like academia, right? So you get this kind of almost tenured position, and often you kind of start somewhere in the middle or lower down, and people at the Guggenheim have been there. People at the Guggenheim have been there for 25 or 30 years, and they're probably not going to leave for another 20 years. But whereas but what's interesting is the other kind of departments, and I loved your graph also, Emily, of all these other departments, and digital is infusing them. These other departments, you have people in, say, communications who are super smart, super talented. They have skills that curators will never have in their entire lives, which are valuable in museums, but also in other places. And those people, they come to museums because they have an interest in the arts, they love the objects, they have some sort of passion, maybe they studied art history, but they have this kind of agile facility that they can move to another institution as soon as things go bad, and maybe even out of the industry entirely. So you have this kind of faster turnover in the people, I think, that are the kind of immediate interface between the ideas or the content and the audience. But then you have this kind of much slower kind of digestion in the curatorial department, and I think that creates a kind of incredible friction. It's incredible to see the speed at which ideas don't move often in curatorial thinking, and the speed at which kind of content formats and so on are moving on the other side of things. So my interest is to kind of try to bridge those. And I've always thought of this Guggenheim job as like a 3 to 5 year gig. So in like 3.5 years, if I'm still there, you'll have to burn this tape and forget what you heard. But I kind of, I don't know, I don't think I'll see that being the case. I'm really trying to make the most of this small bit of time.
That's quite interesting because it seems like most of us working in museums, we know that it was hard to get inside of this cultural industry of the museums and stuff. There are so many young people trying to get jobs in the institutions, trying to have the sacred long-term contract that you could have in an institution. But Bernardine, you've witnessed something new recently in these past years. You've changed accordingly, actually, part of the products of your company, because there is a new trend of outsiders now.
Yeah, it seems like we focus primarily on exhibitions, as temporary exhibitions at museums, and it seems as though there's a trend towards hiring freelancers and outsiders to get involved in these exhibitions rather than only working with the team of the museum, and bringing outside perspectives into it. And also, there is a huge appetite for temporary exhibitions in emerging markets, and those markets often hire experts from Europe and the US to work with them on temporary projects. So then you also need to have a bit of mobility to be able to work on these temporary projects as well.
I have noticed the same thing, and I have had the thought before that there's the potential that it is easier to work within a museum if you are not bound by the same interstaff issues and silos that the normal staff are. But I wonder, too, if that is a fantasy as well.
Yeah, wishful thinking.
Yes, wishful thinking, and that there is, it more than anything has to do with money.
Yes, it's definitely also that budgets are cut, so people have to be more efficient about how they allocate the funding and not offer full-time jobs. I definitely think that's part of it as well.
Yeah, so it seems like there's a potential for this to maybe begin to affect change, but that right now it's sort of like they actually just end up taking the full-time jobs and turning them into contracts.
But isn't it part of change is looking at difficulties and then turning it around as an advantage rather than a disadvantage, maybe?
So this is the conversation we actually had also yesterday. It seems like there is a polarization in museums, institutions right now, about either incorporating new skills inside of the institution or relying on outsiders. What are the views on that, actually? So should we hire you, or should we hire you as an employee? What do you think about it, actually, Emily? You mentioned that you wanted to go back to an institution rather than being an outsider because you experienced both. What is your take on that?
So I would say my immediate answer doesn't have anything to do with what the field should do, but has more to do with the fact that I am lonely being home all day with my dog. And so I want to go back to a museum so that I can like work on a team and like somebody makes me get to work on time and like I actually have to do the work. As opposed to like sitting at home and do you guys have Pop-Tarts here? I mean,
there are delicacies, sweets, very sweets.
I mean, Pop-Tarts are so good, and they really like holding a Pop-Tart. You are like immediately drawn to your couch. So there's not. I feel like I would like to go back to a museum for personal reasons, but I I also feel like, we discussed this yesterday, there is a sense for me that being intimately involved with a team is very valuable. And so I want to collaborate all the time. And as I'm saying that out loud, there's no reason I can't do that as a temporary employee. But I think I crave that team-based community.
Well, it seems as though technology is allowing people to be freelancers in a more reliable way, as in like you can find new gigs and you're not going to be stuck in a drought. It seems like you might be able to find more places for work around the world, not just in your local community. Apparently in the States, a third of people are freelancers. So if you think about it, and that's grown increasingly over the last 2 years. So maybe it's a trend that's worth noting.
So Troy, do you think we should move from the old school institutions to just team-based projects, including permanent workers or including freelancers? What's your take on that?
Well, so maybe to start with the previous question of kind of to go in-house or out-of-house in general, I think one thing that we learned with my company before I came to the museum, because I went from consulting in a totally different field, was that each institution is kind of radically different, and I think they oscillate between moments when the most valuable information comes from the outside and when the most valuable information comes from the inside. I think that right now, the Guggenheim in particular, we just created a new position, which you could add to your chart, which actually was a long discussion. We basically consolidated a bunch of departments around the idea of publishing. And my argument was it should just be director of publishing. And the argument that won was that it should be department or the director of publishing and digital media. And it just feels like one of those kind of like bridge or kind of scaffolds that in a year or 2 or 3, or I feel like it was 3 or 4 years ago, you won't really need that digital part, because how could you possibly do any kind of publishing without digital anyways?
I didn't call it out, but I had director of new media on there. And new media is a term that just a few years ago was very popular, and now you don't see it anymore at all, because it does seem like, how could this be new media?
Yeah. Yeah, well, sorry, but let me, yeah, because basically what happened with that job was I was pretty convinced that we knew exactly what we needed. A bunch of other people in the museum, I think, were not totally comfortable with understanding what it would mean to reorg around digital. So they brought in a number of outside consultants that came in and did audits and then basically came up with what we already knew. But of course, for the kind of executive level, now they had the kind of alibi they needed to say to the board and to and to the rest of the employees, well, this is the direction we're going in. It's not just our choice. This is what the industry experts say. So I think there's still that kind of role for in these transitory moments for outside information. I think now I'm hoping with the Guggenheim, with this new position filled, we'll have somebody that can come in, get in the trenches, understand what's happening on a day-to-day basis, and actually make change. Because I think it's really difficult to convert a kind of research report into change. I think I'm really curious, Bernadine, how you operate when you are actually bringing a team inside and executing. Because I think executing is a lot different than providing advice or expertise. In terms of this, like, just to answer your question then, like, should it just be teams? Like, how dematerialized should we become? I think what's really exciting about museums is kind of like the actual institutionness of them. The fact that they're not flimsy. And I think like for the kind of myth of art to persist, the idea that like it's both kind of can be sold on the open market and is priceless at the same time. I think you need kind of heavy institutions. And so I think like if they devolve into this kind of like super flat hierarchies of like the kind of like startup model of like Odesk curators or something like that, I think that would kind of basically be like the New York Times trying to become BuzzFeed. The New York Times should become a better New York Times.
I agree. I think that it's really important to have a strong person within the organization that is a full-time employee that helps the sustainability of the projects, that helps the coherence of the institution as an institution, but you should find the right exterior people for that specific project to work with that core team?
Sorry. I think that there's also an argument for the workers' rights angle as well, in that it's very easy when you're just hiring contract workers to not worry about diversity, to not worry about health insurance, to not worry about these things that are incredibly important when you have people as your full-time employees. And so I think that's just another angle to think about of like, the de-staffing of museums as a way to like not pay benefits is incredibly troubling.
Yeah,
Emily,
I agree.
Emily, you had a point earlier on that your job should disappear. And actually, Troy, you're kind of saying the same, that eventually we all get back to a director of publication instead of having a director of new media. Are there still, could you name some new jobs that are still going to continue in some ways? Are there real new positions that are needed? And please cut the bullshit that we had on the previous slide. So let's cut it. Let's not try to work on titles. Let's talk about people doing stuff. Are there new positions needed in a museum?
My immediate answer would be what you just said. Publishing to the web is publishing. So I can work in a publishing department explicitly on digital formats and just be a publishing manager. I can work in a communications department explicitly on social media and just be a communications manager. And so my feel is you have to look at, if you remove digital, look at the core function of the job. The platform doesn't matter, and that it is, we all will still have jobs. It's just that we won't be so worried about like, but how do we do it on an iPhone? Like you just will do it on the iPhone.
Yeah, I think yesterday's Stedel Museum mentioned digital is the new normal, and I think that's really true. That's what we're seeing.
I mean, even registrars, there are applications being made that registrars are going to be digital registrars doing condition reports on an app. Then does that mean that you need to turn it into a head of digital registrar services? It should just be a registrar and you're using a new tool. It's the same with publishing and social media.
So Troy, if everything goes right, in few years, okay, in 6 months, you lose the digital initiatives, in just architecture initiatives. What's happening about that?
Well, so yeah, I think that the kind of lasting position, say in curatorial, would be like, so the big conversation for me, the job title as it originally was for the job that I have was curator of urban studies and digital initiatives. And I fought a battle on two fronts. I wanted to change digital initiatives to digital culture, and I wanted to change urban studies to architecture, and I only won one of those. I think that in digital culture, I also feel like is sort of a little bit of a bridge. I think it could be something like technology culture or something. I think there is a position in museums for curators that are specifically kind of looking into, have an expertise in the way that new technologies are reshaping our lives. I think that's kind of one of the greatest things of the kind of modern museum is that it's a space where you can go and try to make sense of a rapidly changing world through different artifacts, objects, interpretations. And I think that technology, whether it's digital and devices and mobile, or it's genetic engineering or weather manipulation, we're kind of entering like a really wild phase of kind of accelerating digital technology, and I think museums have a role to play in helping to make sense of that for the public.
I think everyone should just have the title like Museum Ninja or something like that. Have all the tools.
Well, and I was just going to make the distinction that I feel like actually you might be the only person whose title doesn't change, because studying digital is different from doing digital. So like there's a sense that that somebody in your position would keep that.